Okay, take it away.
All right. So I want to emphasize that marine no-take areas are, at least in our state, ostensibly about protecting biodiversity within their bounds, but also an ancillary benefit, which is very useful in marketing marine parks, is that they can, and they do have benefits across a wider area, not just in biodiversity, but also in fishing. And so if you haven't heard it before, we call it a spillover effect. And it's basically the idea that a marine park like the one on the top right there produces lots of fish, etc. And eventually, due to expansion of home ranges, some of those large animals will make their way outside. That's adult spillover. But also larger fish have bigger babies and more babies. And so when they do so, they tend to disperse outside these marine areas. And so the marine park no-take areas really punch above their weight in terms of larval and adult spillover. That's been well demonstrated. So we often say this, but I always have the caveat that that is not, it's useful, but it's not the main role of marine parks. Oh, and this is one of the East Coast Australian world-leading studies that was done. You don't have to look at all the figure, but basically it showed that in the area, this was the Keppel Islands in southern Queensland, and they were looking at a snapper and coral trout, very important and quite delicious fish, I'd have to say, to caught recreationally and commercially. In that particular area, about 20%, as is often the case, of the area was in no-take sanctuary zones. But when they looked at the larvae that came out of these and did the various genetic typing to work out where they come from, they found up to 70% of the babies that grew up to be fished were from that small 20% no-take area. This is the larval spillover that we'd all thought happened, but until this particular paper, now there's been more, we hadn't had the technology to prove it. So that was quite an exciting paper, actually. We always talk about bigger fish in marine parks and more species of fish, but there's also another aspect where if you have an area where you can't exploit the animals, and that's behaviorally. And so this is just an example from a paper we've just put out, long time in coming, actually. And it involves what we call the fear factor. Fish in protected areas behave differently to those outside, and that can have ramifications to their breeding and all sorts of things. So in this particular example, and there's an animation in here, I think, this particular fish has come up, moved towards the fish has taken off, and that distance, the point at which the snorkeler spearer came up, we call that the FID, the flight initiation distance. So without going too much into it, basically when we looked at a suite of species, this is just an example of the yellowfin brim, we find that inside marine parks, that is to the left of the 0 line down the bottom there, we have the lowest flight initiation distance. That is, you can get closer to the animal. They're tamer, if you want to say it that way. But as soon as we get outside the marine parks, these animals are very wary and they move apart. And that has ramifications to their social behavior. They spread apart more, they don't interact as much. So there's a suite of these sublethal effects of fishing, which we are looking more at these days, as well as the others. Just keeping it a little bit sciencey, and just a couple of examples. And the report has tables of all these papers with summaries, if you're interested, because you often, maybe not anymore, but you're certainly used to hear the complaint that this is all made up, there's no science, blah, blah, blah. There's an amazing amount of really good science, and New South Wales is a world leader. A lot of the good scientists are actually in DPI fisheries, and I'll talk a bit about how their work doesn't make it through to the upper echelons of DPI and how that's a problem. This group, and they often use what's called BRUVs, these underwater videos, to estimate with bait, to estimate fish present. And they basically found that fish abundances were much greater across the marine reserves compared to the partially protected areas just next to them, the ones where you could fish, but you couldn't commercially fish. So it was quite a striking result across New South Wales. Another group of workers were particularly interested in spearfishing. And again, for a couple of key species, that looks like a mowong and a brim, they detected positive impacts of having these no-take prohibited areas. And so that was another good one. And another paper that came out in these top journals really showed various targeted species were more abundant in marine reserves. So it's a pretty major theme about this. And I just thought I'd put this one up. If anyone knows of Graham Edgar, he's sort of pretty much the world leading marine scientist in Australia, you'd have to say. And he runs Reef Life Survey around the country. And pretty much his email to me, or we had a good discussion back and forth, and he said, pretty much fishers, he felt, will bemoan the consequences of blanket opposition against any protected areas by some politicians and themselves, I suppose, and an over-reliance of fisheries management on computer models. That sounds what we all think, I think. And that they really should be getting behind marine parks for sustainable fishing. Pretty pictures for a second. Yes, there's some lovely environments out there. So how much do we protect? So you might have heard of the 30 by 30 initiative. That's a UN initiative that seems to have spread globally and on land and sea. So it's a terrestrial and ocean hope aspiration, basically meaning we want 30% protection of the oceans by 2030 and 30% of the land by 2030. Now, this is a very big ask, and you'll see why in a minute. But where did this 30% come from? Well, in the ocean, various work's been done to show that if you can protect 30% of the spawning stock of places where fish could breed, for instance, you're liable, because fish have a lot of babies, to be able to replenish the rest of the ocean if you design them properly. So it's not just a made-up number for the ocean, around about 30%. Some think more, and the figure down the bottom there is a summary of lots of papers that have looked at all different sorts of invertebrates and vertebrates and put their thoughts in what percentage should be protected minimally. So it's around 30%. So that's where the 30 comes from. Sad truth, we look at the ocean, a map of the ocean, and this is what roughly is being protected at the moment. It's about 2%. Now, you may have heard, and there's been lots of press about this 30 by 30 initiative, and it's a great one, that we're getting there. We're a long way from there. And the main reason is that first 30%, they do not define it as no take, which, if you know your IUCN categories, is number 1 or 2, where you cannot exploit. That includes mining and fishing and other sorts of things. And if these proper no-take areas are shown, it's just what we see here. And we'll notice the federal government recently claimed a great advance in the Macquarie Island marine network. But even then, it's still only around 10% in Australia, as we'll see. So really quite a shock to see how little of the ocean is properly protected. So in Australia, we're doing a bit better, but nothing to get too excited about. Australia has about 10%. That's overall, that's outside state waters. That includes Macquarie Island. And so whenever you read about these, just dig a bit deeper and just see if they mean no-take sanctuary where you cannot fish at all. These partial protected areas, if they're included, they boost the amount, but I've just shown you they're not that effective. And so state by state, there's the leaderboard there. We're doing a lot better than Tasmania, but we're still only doing 7% of our coastal out to 3 nautical miles area is being protected through proper no-take parks. There it is, 7%, those little tiny bits there. Lord Howe Island is up for review at the moment, and I'll talk a bit more, if you like, later about what we need to do there. But you can see the coast is split into what we call bioregions. There's 5, or I think there's actually 6 in New South Wales. And the idea was that all of these bioregions around Australia would have a marine park in them with a substantial no-take area. So if we look at New South Wales, we'll see Byron, we'll see Solitary Islands, we'll see Port Stephens, Great Lakes area, we'll see Bateman's dragging along there, and the red one in the middle is Sydney. And a very sad story there. Any push for Sydney Marine Park has been squashed successively again and again. So in fact, in Sydney, which is a climate change hotspot, over 600 species, 20% of the fishers in Australia cast their lines out there, and yet less than 2% no-take reserves, less than 2%. So over 98% of the ocean is not protected properly. We do, around our area, have a system of marine aquatic reserves. These were set up independently and separately by the state years ago. And there's some quite interesting ones there. The ones in Sydney are shown here. There's some quite large ones. The key thing to note about these is most of them you can fish in. So this is a map of outer Sydney Harbour and the North Head. And you can see the North Harbour Aquatic Reserve is quite large. And that must be one of the most intensively fished places in Australia, right there. There's a little one up top called Cabbage Tree Aquatic Reserve, you can see, and you can't fish in that. But look at the size. So this large aquatic North Harbour Aquatic Reserve, you cannot take shellfish and various other things. So it's really allowing the massively popular line fishing boats and shore to take place inside this aquatic reserve. So it is by no means a proper marine sanctuary. Shelley Beach, on the other hand, the one I just showed you, is really a global example of how even a small area, if properly enforced, can be valuable. So a recent paper by some colleagues of mine, again, showed this small area, and you're seeing most of it in this slide here. Beautiful place, but no fishing. And the reason there's no fishing, that it works, is that we have local education and enforcement. There's only one fisheries inspector for most of Sydney, and it's quite easy to avoid that person. But if all the people here are on board, which they are, with no fishing, and they're actually education groups, the Friends of Cabbage Tree Bay do a great job. It's just so effective, even in this small area. And that's because a lot of these fish you see there are very popular. They don't move very far. They have very small home ranges of tens and hundreds of meters. So we hold this up as not ideal. I mean, you're going to need a lot of these to get to 30%, but it's one way forward, is these small, well-enforced sanctuaries. Another aspect we need to emphasize is that fish, invertebrates, even algae, adopt the Nemo phenomenon, as you can see there. So they disperse through larval dispersal. So the adults, as I just mentioned, often don't go very far. Everything from a barnacle, which just settles and stays there for its whole life, or a kelp, which does the same thing. The dispersive phase as a baby, very different to mammals and us, so a bit hard to get your head around. But because we have this flow, surface flow of this East Australian current, it picks up babies and moves them around. So it's not that useful having a large marine park in one area, because it'll form a source for lots of babies heading south, but it won't be replenished from the north mainly. So we need what we call a network of connected marine parks. There's a bit of science behind this already, and the parks, as they're set up, are of some value, but we need to keep this in mind when we're deciding where to put things, this connectivity aspect. Things were going along quite well up till about 2013 in terms of new marine parks with no-take areas. Then with the stroke of a pen, our fisheries minister came in and created what was called an amnesty. So quite a number, dozens of those small no-take areas, which had been set up and going for years in some cases, where overnight fishing was allowed, particularly Bateman's Marine Park and Solitaries, with the then Environment Minister backing the fisheries minister and saying there's no evidence, which of course there was even then. Some of these areas have been opened up since, but we feel it was a lot of scientists felt it was a huge travesty doing this. So the report discusses these having to be returned to no-take status. Trouble is, it takes months to fish down an area. It takes years to build it up again. So if you make a mistake, it's very hard to fix that. All right, so getting onto the report a little bit, and I don't have a whole lot more to go, so we can have long discussions as required. So Australian Marine Conservation Society approached us about putting together a report to really highlight the fact that there'd been some great mismanagement, we felt, in New South Wales through the government itself, its links with the DPI, and the DPI had mismanaged marine parks, we felt, and we still feel that. So we worked with Danielle and James, that I think Gary knows, who are just a real shot in the arm for that society, that Conservation Society, and also New South Wales Marine Environment. They've really been the driving force. Gigi and I produced this this report, which is in, and you'll have to get a copy yourself to have a look. I'm not going to go through it step by step, but basically the first section was doing what I've just done then to try and demonstrate what a wonderful environment we have and why marine parks that are no-take actually work, and we have to have a certain number of them. The second part was a bit of a critique of what the government had done. And one of the things they had done is created a thing called MEMA, the Marine Estate Management Authority, who then set about to create a different process for protecting the marine environment that was already in place. They didn't totally scrap everything, although this amnesty I mentioned was part of that scrapping, but they brought in another technique. So globally, the best practice for working out where places should be, which can fully protect marine life, is called the CAR process. It's comprehensive, adequate, and representative. And I won't discuss that, but I can. So basically, there's a scientific methodology for working out where these areas should be put. Well, that was pretty much scrapped, and they brought in a thing called the TARA approach, threat and risk assessment. So basically, they said, let's have a look at all the threats and risks, which sounds reasonable, and we'll assess those through a matrix table, and we'll work out what the main pressures are on the marine environment. We'll rank them, and then we will work on the top three. So what, of course, happened was they said, well, okay, let's list the threats. So they listed four-wheel driving and ocean and pollution and shell collecting, whatever. Then they listed fishing, but they didn't put it as fishing. They put it as 8 different categories. So there was recreational fishing from a boat, commercial fishing from shore. There was all those sorts of things. And of course, when they did their matrix of importance and risk, they didn't make the top 10 or 15. So fishing was not amongst the top 10. Four-wheel driving was considered much more a risk to the marine environment than fishing, which, if you think about it, is absolute rubbish. And so the report notes that and notes the methodology for this TARA approach. The other problem with it, of course, is we don't have all this evidence. We don't have find evidence that a particular spot fishing is impacting a fish at that spot. So what they did is they form all this information through an expert panel, and the expert panel uses their knowledge and wisdom to come up with ranking as well. So for all these reasons, what sounds like a reasonable approach pretty much is worthless. And so one of our recommendations I'll talk about in a minute is scrapping that or using it, but still showing the primacy of this CAR approach, this proper scientific approach to marine protection. So there it is again. So pretty much the report, that's the second part. The third part were recommendations on what we should do, which I'll talk about in a second. And then the final part was quite a long table going for a number of pages where we've gone through and looked at the actual evidence for the effectiveness of marine parks, especially in New South Wales, but around Australia. We didn't do them all because that would have been a telephone book-sized tome, but there's a number of pages showing these actual papers, what results they found and for what species, just to hopefully put the nail in the coffin for anyone who dares to say that there's no evidence that marine parks and sanctuary zones are effective. Oops, there we are. So some of the recommendations, and again, I won't go through them in detail, but you can discuss more. One of our main things, which is going to be a tricky one, is the Marine Parks Authority and marine parks rest solely at the moment, pretty much all solely within DPI fisheries. And our recommendation is to extract it, the admin and the scientists, and to place them where we feel they belong in the Department of the Environment, to work alongside and in parallel with terrestrial scientists and managers that share common goals. Now, New South Wales Fisheries, when I was a lad in the 70s, was a different beast. It was very research focused, and the research made it right to the top to be implemented. DPI now has layers, as many of these departments do. The bottom layer is where my colleagues, the scientists, sit. They come up with this world-beating research. They send it to their comms department. They're given a budget to produce some really good comms on these results, which they did, and then it goes no further. So we know there's some very important comms, small movies and brochures, which will never see the light of day for various reasons. Then you get to the top level and there's a mismatch. So we feel that that's very important. We'll see how that goes. There's quite a bit of ostensible support amongst parliamentarians from both sides of the House and independents, but we'll see how that goes. As I mentioned earlier, one of the travesties and very painful travesties that us marine scientists saw happen in 2013 and 19 was the overnight removal of these sanctuary zones. And so they must be put back, obviously, ASAP. That's a definite recommendation. We also acknowledge the amazing change, and we spoke about this earlier before start of the talk, in citizen science. Citizen science has really come of age. It used to be mocked by scientists a couple of decades ago, and now there are some key initiatives. Graham Eagers Reef Life Survey. We work with citizen science in many ways ourselves, as do others up and down the coast, acknowledging that many of these people are out there all the time. They're really good observers and they really want to make a difference, and they do. And with appropriate training that we all need, we can get some really good data from these people. And it also is a great way to empower local communities, which is very important. And so the education piece is obviously there, and the enforcement piece. There's a bit of good movement working with Indigenous peoples at the moment. The Gamay Rangers, for instance, are a great group that actually train up Indigenous rangers through the national park system. You probably know more than me about that. And a couple of the key ones are really getting into the marine environment and interested in marine protection. So we're hoping to work more in that realm. There are some missing spaces in the marine environment. For instance, Sydney doesn't have a marine park still. We had a very long, drawn-out process where we all put in submissions. Our scientists put in submissions in support, and it was shelved. In fact, I was on the radio with the Minister Noel Blair, at the very time he said, "Oh, we've decided to shelve them." I think an expletive came out of my mouth, which they laughed at, but yes, I wasn't very impressed. So we're hoping to get those reinstated, not just the Hawkesbury Shelf, which is the area around where I am, but also Eden, a very productive fisheries area. And then finally, there's a process in place of making a coordinated document, and it's a draft mainland marine park management plan, which is flawed in many ways. We've all written issues with it. It doesn't use the CAR framework that I mentioned earlier, and we would like to see that scrapped, and with the newish government coming in to make a fresh start in reforming the marine management across the state, accenting on marine parks. So yes, this is the painful story of the Sydney Marine Park. Everything from the top left, a really quite interesting bioregional report that came out, friends of mine did back in the, must have been the 90s when I first got to UTS. Then the announcement by the Minister that there would be a submission period for a potential Sydney Marine Park with some no-take areas, not many, by the way. Then there was the backflip, as we like to call it, where the Minister changed their mind. The actual reason given on the radio at that time was they'd been told by some of the fishers that because the fishers would have to go a bit further to fish, they might fall off the rocks. So there was a safety issue. So safety was the ostensible reason they scrapped the Sydney Marine Park, and it's still sitting there to be revitalised, we hope. And yes, I might sound a bit tired when I say how many submissions we've written and how many deputations we've had, but the fight is ongoing. And, you know, I have a little bit more positive than usual at the moment. We seem to have got a bit better reception across bipartisan support within Parliament and beyond. That makes me think we might have, you know, with support of people like NPA, I think we've got a bit of a hope in getting some marine protection improvements. Excuse me. On the cards. We do have our societies. AMSA, you've probably heard of, the Australian Marine Science Association, that has a New South Wales branch, and we've been heavily involved through time in whether it's submissions or meeting ministers or whatever, in trying to convince them of the importance of no-take areas. Australian Coral Reef Society as well. I spent a small stint as president in. Another thing I'll mention, I can send these to you. One of the things you often get are, you know, the usual, what I call the myths, but various things people trot out to suggest that marine parks aren't worth developing. And so I've developed a double pager basically that I can send anyone that wants one, pretty much addressing what I think are some of the common myths like these ones here. And it's really a thing that I wasn't allowed to put it into the main report. So it's sort of a bit of a separate document with the evidence against each of these myths, really written in a way that a poly or a media person might think is worth reading. Hopefully to scotch these erroneous myths. The success of Cabbage Tree Bay, we're hoping to ride on that success, and there's a number of initiatives in Sydney and further afield now to protect small areas. This is Mona Vale, this is called Bongan Bongan, and it's a very, as you can see, it's a very small area that's have high biodiversity value, and there's a real emphasis locally to protect this. And there's quite a group there. They've got the ear of the local pollies. They've had an event at Parliament House. Of course, there's the usual backlash from some fishers in a council meeting, which makes it interesting, I guess. But there's a number of these sites. Vaucluse is another one with a sympathetic mayor, and the local member is the Shadow Minister of Environment, Kelly Sloan. And so, you know, these small victories, if they happen, may set the scene for getting towards 30 to 30. Maybe not by 2030, but hopefully, but getting to that 30% value at some point in the future. So I think that's about it. Just to let you know, in case I forget, the little poster on the left there is regarding a marine park forum that we're holding at UTS on the 13th of November up at UTS. We held one about a year ago, which was really good. We had a lot of people there, but there was a lot of Zooming back then, and so we had you know, live crosses from people up and down the coast to talk about the situations in their areas. And so we're hoping we get a reasonable attendance by decision makers, which we think we will, to hopefully move the momentum forward from this report to get some action. So I think that is about it, actually. Yeah, that's about it. So happy to answer questions and get some good feedback from you guys as you see fit.
I've got quite a few questions, David. If you just stop sharing, we'll
sure.
see what the people are.
I would assume you would, yeah.
Okay. I'll call each of them as they go through, rather because there's quite a few. Paula, what I'll do is I'll say the name and you can ask your first questions, or you can get me to do the version of it if you'd prefer. But Paula, the effect of foreign fishing in Australian waters, do you want to add any more to that? You can all unmute now. I muted you all before, except for David, you might have noticed.
Feel free to mute me whenever you want now. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, you can ask a question, but I can get the gist. We have, like most nations in the 70s, the United States Conventional Law of the Sea came in, where we're allowed to put our 200-mile zone around the country. And I remember being at uni in those days, and the idea was you could exploit it yourself or you could research it, otherwise others could come in and take. And so we thought that would be the golden years for marine research jobs was happening, but it never quite eventuated. But in any case, we do have foreign vessels that come up to the Barrier Reef legally in some cases. You've probably heard of the super trawler, that was of various super trawlers that came in and did their work in southern Australia. And so we do have that foreign fishing around the country. It's more, of course, where it really happens is in the Antarctic waters, so around Macquarie Island, which is owned by Australia, and the northern waters like Torres Strait and the Coral Sea, and on the other side near Timor. And there's some pretty horrendous things go on with those fisheries. The Australian military and AFMA have enforcement, but of course it's such a huge area. So yeah, in close around the state waters, not such an issue.
Just as a follow-up to that, David, is the international convention structure strong enough to protect these waters with cooperative nations?
I'm no expert, but the answer is no, of course.
Yeah.
and like all these things, putting it in a marine park means nothing if there are people who want to abuse it and there's no
Yeah.
one to enforce it. And of course, you can get away with anything at the high seas, as they say. So yeah, I'm sure it's fairly poor. And Australia is really the 6th biggest continental shelf in the world, but the 55th biggest fishing nation. And the reason for that is we're too tropical. New Zealand is way above us in fisheries. They have much more productive, colder waters. So, really, unless it's boutique things like giant clams or something, Australia is not necessarily the most attractive place if you're a legal foreign fisher to go.
Ross played with a 30 by 30 and asked marine OECMs possible in addition to no take MPAs. Ross, you may want to translate that for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, in the terrestrial context, it's very unlikely that we're going to get 30% protected by 2030, and that was regarded as what would be required to not lose 25% of species globally. And so they come up with this OECM, other effective conservation measures, that are not in addition to the national park, which is the gold standard. So I'm just wondering, could that work for the marine system? It's unlikely we're going to get to 30%, but what are some of the mitigating activities that could be included? And I think you mentioned some already within community engagement that could mitigate the losses while we're waiting for the politicians, et cetera, to catch up and do the job properly.
Yeah. Hi, Ross. Good to see you, by the way.
Good. Yeah, good to see you, mate. Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, it has.
I'm glad, David. I'm glad you actually recognised him. I'm just curious what that thing is under his nose.
Yeah.
I'm just getting ancient, mate.
Because
these things happen. You go into
He's eating too much ice cream.
Yeah.
Too much ice cream.
No, Ross has strong UTS links from way back, and he's done wonderful things overseas in the meantime. So he's
respect those too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And at Marine Park Forum, I guess I was a little bit out in left field with my thoughts on this, but I think I still stand by them. And that is, and of course, land's a different thing. Let's face it, there isn't 30% of New South Wales in anywhere near pristine state to be able to just put a fence around it. So there's got to be some other, what do you call it? OE? Yeah, whatever your
OECMs, yeah.
OECM, one of these OECMs.
Other effective conservation measures.
I like it. The O things. And I can see why that's important. In the marine environment, I think we've got a chance. Now, the other OECMs would be things like coral restoration or kelp restoration or Indigenous protected areas, and even the partial protected areas that I wasn't very impressed with. They all are better than nothing. But the trouble, what happens, they're very easy to greenwash with these things. So there's nothing wrong with them per se. And if we recognize they don't hold a candle to a no-take area, they are not, they're useful. But what happens is they're used by people to say, oh, we've got 30% because we're doing this much coral restoration or kelp restoration. That's the risk. And also, I having done a lot of work on the barrier reef, and I've seen how there's quite interesting coral restoration, but there's no way it's going to have much effect at all on saving the reef if we don't address climate change. But of course, the people in the Great Barrier Reef Foundation heavily funding coral restoration, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think it gets used a bit to say, look what we're doing, wonderful things in the ocean.
Yeah, it's a band-aid, really.
Band-aid. And so Indigenous protected areas, I mentioned the Gamay Rangers. In speaking to them, they are actually very keen to have actual no take within these if they ever get put up. And so I think working together with them, but I just don't want no take areas to get watered down by people thinking that these other methods would be equivalent in protecting the ocean.
Sure.
That's my thought.
Now,
Thank you.
Yeah, Ross raised that in the context of you also saying 30% spawning stock, David. I'm just curious as regarding the OECMs, whether or not partial closes on particular seasons would have a major impact.
Yeah, well, for certain species they might do, and in fact, fisheries for years have had closures. And if you go to the islands, they'll, way back when they knew to, do not catch this fish at this time. The orange roughy fishery didn't do that. And of course, you know,
Well, that's
by the
true.
time they realized they should protect the spawning areas, they were gone. And
Yep.
so, yeah, so yeah, you're right. I mean, strategically, certain species, migration pathways, little temporary closures can have effect. They're very hard to enforce, and that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, I'm not saying other things won't be helpful, but I just feel this mantra of no take has got to be done. Otherwise, it'll very quickly get white-handed away to
Now, what you raised the Gamay ranges there, and I'm going to jump to May. Would you like to get some more clarification on what the Gamay ranges is all about and Indigenous involvement in the marine space?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah.
I think I've heard of their name, but I haven't really heard what they've been up to. And yeah, it sounds really interesting what's been mentioned.
Yeah, I'm quite excited about that particular group because Gamay and Botany Bay is, you know, really an exceptionally beautiful area that's been completely inundated by industry. You've got Tower Point, magnificent, and then you've got the Foreshore Drive area that we used to sample fish. It was considered one of the most productive seagrass areas in New South Wales. It's all gone now, and the container terminals there instead. So you've got, and then you've got the Gamay Ranges, especially on the south side at Kurnell. And very quickly, my understanding from going to some talks by one of the leaders, that it all started pretty much when they were met by, I think it was Malcolm Turnbull back in the day, and they walked along the beach and noted to him that we used to catch cockles and things here, which are now just missing. And somehow between that and a few other bits and pieces, they developed a program for their young people to actually enter, I think it's the actual national parks, and get trained up as rangers. And some of them are being trained up and going to uni and doing marine science and that sort of thing. So, you know, there really is a bit of a pathway for them to be much more involved in marine conservation, I think.
Okay, Gary, do you want to explain why you think sanctuaries may not be the best name?
Yes, David. NPA is in the process of revising their policy on marine protection. And one idea that consistently comes up is that we should start using the term marine national park for sanctuaries, so that in the public's mind, it has the status of a terrestrial park where, you know, you don't go shooting the kangaroos and that sort of thing. And so I'm wondering what you thought about using language like that. And I think Victoria uses that term for their fully protected sanctuaries. What do you think about that idea to help the politicians sell it a bit more to the public?
Yeah, I must admit, it's annoying. I keep jumping between terms. Now, you know, no take is accepted worldwide. But then I had a fisher come up and say, oh, we already do no take, we catch and release. And I went, oh yeah, I guess if you didn't know what it actually meant, no take could mean catching the fish and releasing, which a lot of fishers do. And so I thought, well, that's not a great name either. Sanctuary, as you say, is not great. I like the idea. The only thing I'd say is maybe just have a look around and see what names are used a little bit, you know, in the region, just so we're not saying something, a name that doesn't mean anything anywhere else. But yeah, I like the idea, and I think sanctuaries, I'm not real happy with that either. So
cool.
I don't know.
Okay. Thank
you. Marco, got totally confused, I think, about the collection rules, or maybe thinks everybody would get confused about the collection rules for different locations, wondering why you're allowed to collect cockle shells, etc. Marco, do you want to do a riff on that further?
Yeah,
Marco.
David, and everybody.
That Marco.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm sure he's not confused, by the way, David.
No, not Marco.
It was just a comment. I was reading Cape Banks Aquatic Reserve. Basically, you can do anything with any method, spear fishing and fishing and whatever you do. And there is a very short list of things that you cannot take, which includes barnacles. But I didn't know people would detach barnacles from the rock. They have not, basically they are
too many legs.
Yeah, they got nothing apart from the longest penis in the animal kingdom relative to the size. I don't know whether people eat
Now hold
that
on,
or
this
what.
is a family
It's a
affair,
family show.
Marco.
Yeah. But I've been mentioning that on radio at early morning. I think it's fine. Anyway, so there are a number of things like also I see starfish. I don't know, maybe somebody eats starfish and anemones. I didn't know people would eat anemones. But anyway, there's such a short list of fish that are protected over there that it's kind of ridiculous. I mean,
I agree there. One of the recommendations is, okay, you've got some regulations around aquatic reserves, just flip them all to no take. That's a quick way to get a little bit more action. And apparently that has got some traction already. But I agree. And the other thing with no take reserves is, guess who the main group that does the line fishing? It's white guys, to be honest. And guess who does all the removing of shellfish that is prohibited in these? Various ethnic groups are being, pretty much, I think, unfairly targeted in an area where really it should be no take for everybody.
Yeah,
not good.
anyway, thank you so much. Very informative.
Where's Cape Banks?
It is on the north shore, just around the northern shore of Botany Bay on the ocean side there. Yeah.
David, does the wreck on the inland side of Cape Banks improve the number of fish there?
Oh, I haven't been on that one, but yeah, wrecks are interesting because obviously, you go to a wreck, you attract fish, and so I think that's sort of the logic that DPI Fisheries used in dumping artificial reefs off the coast for fishing. Yeah. I'm a conscientious objector to that. Since I like complaining about everything. No, that's not the case. Because there's this idea that if you add structure, dump a ship, add purpose-built framework off the coast, and you're increasing fish, that's a good thing for nature. Now, to me, a good thing for nature is being natural. And so, this sort of thing, I mean, I'm in part of a project called Project Restore in Sydney Harbour. What we're doing, we're going to be restoring bits of already degraded habitat to try and get more complexity, et cetera, et cetera. I think I can feel better about that than popping large habitats on natural areas. They might be sediment, but I can tell you this stuff lives in sediment for fishing purposes and claiming they're doing a good thing for nature. So, if the wreck's already there, go and have a nice dive. There's some beautiful stuff out. But as far as dumping new things, I think you've got to be very, very careful while you're doing it.
Yeah. Paula, do you want to clarify what you would like to find out about the 5 island reserves off Kembla?
Well, just that it's a beautiful area with a lot of fish, where weirdly the Port Kembla series outfall is. But I was under the impression that it is a national park or protected by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. But it's not part of the marine reserve.
No, the 5 islands the 5 islands are actually NPWS islands as land.
Oh, as land.
As land. I don't know if there's any protected zone around them in the waters themselves.
No, there isn't. But half of the waters around those 5 islands are indicative sanctuaries proposed by Southern Sydney branch of NPA to be part of a Sydney Marine Park. Yes. And we've actually got indicative sanctuaries indicated for all of Greater Sydney's waters that add up to 27% no take, David. So
loving it.
We've been saying that to the government. We've got some indicative areas that will solve your problem about the 30 to 30. We're not saying it's perfect, but hey, yeah, places like the 5 islands and parts of Lake Illawarra, there are all sorts of places we've sampled using the car type approach that we're offering as a gift to the new government to make their job a bit easier.
In fact, that's not.
And there's quite sorry. I was just going to say there's quite a strong approach. Indigenous presence there too, isn't there?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so my comment that I like the idea of proposing these areas because, for instance, one area north of Sydney's Moody National Park up near Gosford, and it's a beautiful area, and it's called a marine extension. So I don't know all the details, but that might be
the details of that. The details of that is that it is a pretty unusual creature. Actually, it happens to be gazetted under the National Parks and Wildlife Act, extending from the terrestrial part. How they got away with it, I do not know.
Makes a lot of sense, but doesn't it, to have those connected areas? Yeah.
I've actually suggested they do the same to extend Tara Point to include the aquatic reserve and give it an overlap with an extra protection so that other things are protected as well.
There's one little thing you've got to be a bit careful about, and Booty's a good example of that. It turns out the areas around the Booty, before it even started, was one of the most depauperate areas for fish and marine life, just that particular area. And so, of course, what happens, it gets protected. Then someone down the line goes, let's compare it to the areas where we fished. And they go, oh, it's worse. It started out worse, and this happens a lot around the world where the leftover areas are put in. They're called residual areas. Actually, a name for it, and Australia is particularly bad at this too. Picking an area, oh, here's a nice marine park, but it's an area no one else wanted. So, surprise, it's not as good when you measure it later. So, just got to be careful.
Yeah, we face the same problem with getting the leftovers on land. Sam wants to go beyond the New South Wales borders, and he's curious about your priorities for the southern New South Wales areas that should be protected in Commonwealth waters.
Oh, good question. I won't be able to answer properly, but I do know that you know, it's amazing what's offshore. You know, I remember when Bateman's Park was put forward, they did a bunch of side scan sonar to find out that that actually has more offshore, deeper reefs than we ever imagined, much more than the northern half of the state, which aren't now protected. So they go off into Commonwealth waters. So there's a lot of habitat, seamounts, all sorts of things there. I can't give you any information on what's going on with the Southeast Australian Marine Park in the Commonwealth, but yeah, it's pretty.
Yeah, thanks, David. So in your report, and in your presentation, you nominated a couple of areas that you would prioritise for protection, but you're talking about New South Wales waters there solely, are you?
Not solely, because of course, you know, marine environment doesn't go. There's a dotted line that's 3 miles.
No, indeed.
Yeah, so certainly the solitaries is a good example where you need that Commonwealth offshore protection as well. So yeah, it's all got to be bundled in for sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, you can do a paper on it, Sam, for us.
Not sure about that, Brian.
Who's NN? I lost track of naming here. Is that you, Ian, hiding under another initial there, or?
No, probably.
This is asking about how do they police Cabbage Tree Basin?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I know when local police and water police can help. You know, I mean, there's all very well. I think you were painting that picture around Manly, where the local people, you know, by way of persuasion, perhaps. Discourage fishermen, but what happens when you get an arrogant group that just comes in, and how do we go for enforcement? Do water police get involved? Can local police get involved?
Well, yeah, I guess the good news is most people, if you tell them you shouldn't be doing something, they listen, right? So you know, but that's most people, as you say, the arrogant sorts. You know, there was
the cowboys.
The cowboys, yeah. You know, I believe, my understanding is in the past, police have been called. Occasionally you'll get a fisheries inspector. It's interesting, a fisheries inspector has stopped us about 3 times doing our fish counts with a slate and no fishing gear along. But most fishers say they've never been stopped by the local fisheries inspector. But yeah, I think it's mainly through education, and you know, most people have taken that. But you're right. If someone really wants to get in there and there's no actual enforcement around, it can be difficult.
So can local police be called?
Local police can be called, yeah. They've actually come out to check out on us occasionally.
David, if I add to that answer, so Ian, one of the main benefits around Cabbage Tree Bay is the very active Friends of Cabbage Tree Bay group. So they're down there on weekends, Saturdays and Sundays, doing education, doing fish identification counts. Everyone who comes out of the water, mainly divers, what have you seen? And they're actively educating everybody who wanders past there. Wow. And that's nearly everybody who visits Manly, takes the long walk to Shelley. And so the local community are very aware of the protection of the area and they will call out and call police
Oh, good.
if they see someone in a
Mm.
boat doing the wrong thing. They have had some serious altercations. So one particular nobody goes there fishing. So there's no groups of people who turn up to go fishing. But one particular example was a spear fisherman who walked out of the water into the beach at Shelley, and when they were confronted said, "I caught the fish outside of the protected area." So there will always be those people, but then there's equally as many people who come from the scuba diving and spear fishing outside of the protected area of Cabbage Tree. And it just purely demonstrates the spillover effect. So there's a well-known spear fishing track that goes to the south side of Cabbage Tree. I've got this fantastic photo of someone who walked out of the water with something in the order of about a 6-foot Atlantic salmon and from spearfishing, but it demonstrates the benefits at the same time as some of the challenges trying to manage people who will try and do the wrong thing.
Thanks for that.
Absolutely right.
I have actually, where in my background photo, caught up with David, two guys from the fisheries with binoculars, checking out people down at Bulga, collecting abalone and in boats and things like that. So I suppose they get in with a bit, enforcement, do they? How many people we got on the ground for theirs?
Oh, woefully under-resourced. There really is one inspector for 100 kilometers, and the well-connected illegal fishers, they call and say, "Oh, Bob's coming down your way today." So that's one of the things we're pushing for, more
for sure.
money for wheels on the ground. And of course, once they get caught, there's almost no prosecution goes through in New South Wales. Really, some of the most horrendous, obvious cases don't get proceeded with. So maybe one a year.
So we've really got to push politically for that to be strengthened.
Yeah. So I guess little areas like Cabbage Tree Bay, there's the guilt factor and the education factor. Because legally, it's a hard road.
Yeah.
Okay. Lydia's been watching documentaries. Lydia, do you want to talk about or clear your question up, which effectively is what are the marine initiatives in places like India and China, etc., isn't it?
Yes, I just wanted, just out of interest from my cultural background, I just wanted to know a little bit more about what's happening around the world apart from us here in Australia, because that documentary was really heart-wrenching about the Mumbai's fishermen. And they're fishermen by trade, but there's so little fish for them to fish now, and they tried really everything. And also there's an industry with a lot of briberies and all sorts of struggles going on. It was really like it's a lose kind of battle. So I was wondering whether they have done anything in India, and also like country like where I came from, China, has done anything, or they just right now the big problems in our region.
Well, it's interesting. There's a couple of things, and yeah, you're right. I mean, the fishers are going out and they're going down the food chain. They're getting the bait fish that used to feed the bigger fish they used to catch. So it's quite sad for their livelihoods as well. One initiative in China, as the world leader, is aquaculture. I don't think it's a great panacea, but the amazing technology and results they've got in China in getting food fish on the table through aquaculture. And now the new initiative is completely self-contained aquaculture. So one of the proposals, I'm often a little bit down on the Tasmanian salmon industry, where they bring in exotic salmon and grow them up in pens and they escape and all sorts of horrible things happen. But it's Australia's most valuable fishery, and I kind of like the taste of it too. But there's a Chinese proposal to come and do something totally onshore. There's no runoff, no effluent. The effluent gets reused. So there's all those initiatives which take pressure off the marine environment, which I think we could do more with. Philippines is the world leader in tropical marine conservation. They've set up things like Apo Islands, the big example we all like to talk about, where they actually have a marine reserve, and it's been well documented, the advantages, but also the economic advantages, that's one of the world famous places to go diving now, because you see big fish, and it's the only place you see big fish in that whole area. So they're actually doing better than they would have under a subsistence fishing. So there's opportunities in especially tropical areas in terms of marine parks, but also in aquaculture, which I think more has to be done with.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Ross has put up some information from the IUCN. Do you want to go through that, so in case people don't notice it, Ross?
Yeah. I mean, the IUCN is explicitly indicating that, you know, the world's population has to move away from having so much meat in the diet because of, you know, the destruction of habitat for the growing of beef. And so if you're eating beef, then you're on the side of the problem, you're not on the side of the solution. And I think, you know, in terms of demand and supply economics, if people say, well, look, we're not going to eat so much fish until these problems of marine conservation are solved, then you might get a bit more leverage. Now, it would have to be a social movement, of course, but I mean, with the terrestrial environment, there's a lot of vegetarians out there now that are making the meat producers think twice about the way they do things. So I'm putting that out as an eco-ethical approach to dealing with the problem and getting on the side of the solution, not consuming and demanding so many fish, compared to being on the other side by saying we need all these things done, but we're still out there eating fish. And especially for the higher predatory fish, you know, you can dissuade people from eating them by saying they have high mercury levels, etc. But, you know, at some point, some eco-ethical considerations have to come into all these solutions, I think.
Well, the ethical thing is quite interesting because, you know, some people argue that catching wild seafood is much more ethical than you know, a battery-fed chicken or a cow that's destroyed many hectares of Australia's beautiful desert just to you know, to grow up, and we've subsidized it, you know. So there's all sorts of weird arguments about you know, fish actually being the way we should be going if we can do it sustainably. All separate to that, just out of interest, I've been reading a fair bit about the incredible advances in basically lab developed meat products, and it was a bit of a joke a while ago, but all of a sudden it's becoming almost commercial. So imagine, you know, world fisheries, you know, reducing fishing effort by the fact that we can actually obtain scallop meat, crab meat in another way than putting our nets down or traps down in the ocean.
Yeah,
so it's a bit far-fetched still, but the actual price per kilo of this has dropped a lot in the last couple of years through various technologies. So who knows? Maybe we'll solve it through tech. Much as I don't believe in solving the world's problems through technology, maybe this will help.
Yeah, thanks.
And I've got to go to Marco's next comment, given he's talking about an ex-NPA state president, just like myself. Do you want to praise John Turnbull's work, Marco, so that we can all hear it?
Did I? I just mentioned the number of pieces that I read on the book, but yeah, I'm the least qualified here to talk about anything.
Well, it's always nice to hear an ex-NPA state president talked about. There's several of us around. And another link from Marco, and that I think basically gets there, except that Ian did ask about rogue nighttime fishing nations.
The dark fleets from China.
Dark fleets, yes. I don't know if it's just China runs the dark fleet, Ian, if we could go a little bit broader. But
they're certainly a bit bigger than the Philippines in this regard.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, David, you've showed that excellent diagram of the world's no-take zones. Do we know if China's been respecting that with their industrial fishing?
It's a good question. You know, there's that whole Google-sponsored project trying to follow movements of fishing, movements of vessels to find out where the illegal fishing was. And I can't quite bring to my mind, you know, the amount of Chinese illegal fishing in these marine reserves. But I think there was something going on there for sure.
Okay. And I'm going to now call it quits. David has had a very busy day. I'd like to thank you, David, for not only the work that you have presented to us tonight, half of which we were able to record, but but for the thorough presentation that you shared with us and the detailed work that you've put into that report. And let's hope that somewhere along the line, politicians this time will listen and act.
I
So
certainly
thank
hope
you,
so. And
everybody.
thank you for all your
Brian?
questions and excellent comments, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brian, could
Yes.
I beg permission for one last question of David before we let him go?
Oh, all right, David.
David, we have the benefit of having Penny Sharp address the NPA dinner coming up in December.
Yeah.
If you had the opportunity to be at the event, and like, if you're not an NPA member, I should just throw out a plug, become one, turn up, that'd be great. But if you had the opportunity to be there with Penny, what are the 2 key messages that you would want to share with her, given everything that we've talked about tonight?
Grab the Marine Parks Authority and the scientists into your realm, quick, smart. And yeah, pushing the no-take theme. And I hope she shows up. The last couple of times she's supposed to have showed up for various things I've been to, she hasn't been able to make it. So be good to have her here.
She's theoretically she's our guest speaker.
There you go. Well, good luck.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, David.
Thanks,
and look,
David.
the last thank you I want to do for tonight is to Ian for entertaining us all admirably during the 15 minutes when we were listening to his conversation as he tried to solve his problems with his speaker, his microphone. Ian, well done.
New webcam, yeah. Yeah, I was yeah.
You did it.
I was
That's
trying to
great.
get in as best as possible, and I could get nothing. And I got on with and then we did Teams, and we did
it was thoroughly entertaining until we muted you, Ian.
Okay.
And we couldn't even talk. We couldn't
mate-
even tell you because you were on the phone as well.
Sorry.
But Ian, thumbs up for actually getting it solved. Most people would have either given up or gotten their kids to come and work it out for them.
Snatching some sort of victory from the jaws of defeat.
and
Thanks, David.
And just to mention that our next presentation in November will be Raina Raywinkle, who used to be an ecologist with the NPWS and has been travelling all over the place doing nature notes, and his talk will be on the wildlife of Peninsular Malaysia and Borneo. Should be quite fascinating. Okay, that's all for tonight. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you somewhere later on.
I'll stop recording.